Ever heard of the poor man's sandwiches only 50s housewives knew? These clever creations turned the cheapest scraps into filling meals that kept whole families going strong. If they could make magic out of nothing, why don't we remember them today? Cold rice sandwiches were born out of pure necessity and resourcefulness in households that could not afford to let a single grain go to waste. Housewives in the 1950s would gather up leftover rice from the night before, stir it together with mayonnaise for a creamy texture or syrup when they needed sweetness, and spread the mixture thickly between slices of bread. It was filling, cheap, and required nothing more than what was already sitting on the kitchen shelf. Children often carried these sandwiches in their lunchboxes, not because they wanted them, but because that was what kept bellies full until dinner. The texture was unusual, with the rice grains giving a chewy bite, but the bread softened it into something manageable. Syrup versions leaned toward dessert while the mayonnaise versions leaned toward sustenance, showing how flexible one idea could become. It was a sandwich that never pretended to be glamorous, yet it provided quick fuel when times were lean. Cold rice sandwiches are almost forgotten today, but they carry the quiet reminder that survival in the 1950s kitchen was more about cleverness than choice. Cottage cheese and pineapple sandwiches were a sweet and savory combination that showed how 1950s housewives turned pantry items into meals that felt refreshing yet cheap. Canned pineapple was common and affordable, while cottage cheese was viewed as a protein-packed food that could stretch further than meat. When paired together between soft slices of white bread, the sandwich gave a tangy, juicy bite that tasted different from the usual heavy fillers of the time. The pineapple's syrupy sweetness balanced the creamy saltiness of the cottage cheese, making it both light and filling. It was often served at luncheons, church gatherings, or simply as a midday bite for children at home. Housewives valued it not just for its thrift, but for the way it looked on the plate, with pineapple giving it a splash of brightness. It reflected a time when even simple foods carried pride, and combining canned fruit with dairy was considered inventive. Today it may sound strange, but in the 1950s it was seen as clever and satisfying, and for many families it provided comfort without stretching the grocery bill too far. Ketchup sandwiches were the kind of meal that no child forgot, for better or worse. When meat ran out and budgets were stretched thin, a slice of bread slathered with ketchup stood in as lunch or even dinner. Some families used both slices of bread while others folded one slice over to save even more. The tangy sweetness of the ketchup soaked into the bread, making it both soft and messy, but it filled stomachs when little else was available. Packed into lunchboxes, it was often eaten at school by children whose parents had no choice but to make something out of nothing. Housewives knew it was not glamorous, but it provided energy and flavor without cost. In homes where condiments were one of the only things left in the pantry, this sandwich represented survival and resilience. It became a quiet staple of poorer families who had to get creative with what they had on hand. Though rarely spoken of today, ketchup sandwiches reveal how little could be stretched into just enough during lean times. Celery, leaf, and mayonnaise sandwiches showed the frugality of 1950s kitchens where nothing was wasted. Celery stalks were often used for cooking, but the leaves, which many might throw away today, became a valuable part of thrifty meals. Housewives would chop the leaves finely, stir them into mayonnaise, and spread the mixture generously across bread slices. The flavor was bright and slightly bitter, balanced by the creaminess of the mayo. It was not fancy, but it offered crunch and freshness when vegetables were scarce. This sandwich carried pride because it proved how resourceful a homemaker could be, feeding her family with what others would call scraps. Served cold, it made for a quick lunch that carried a surprising burst of green flavor. It fit perfectly into the mentality of stretching every ingredient as far as it could go. Celery leaf and mayonnaise sandwiches are nearly forgotten today, but in the 1950s they were both practical and symbolic of the determination not to waste. For those who grew up eating them, they carried the taste of survival and careful economy. Hash brown sandwiches were a hearty, filling option for families who needed something substantial without spending on meat. Housewives would grate potatoes, fry them in a skillet until golden and crisp, then press them between slices of buttered bread. The result was carb on carb, heavy and satisfying, especially after a long day of labor. The sandwich was warm, greasy, and comforting, often eaten for breakfast or as a quick lunch. It had the same appeal as fried potato cakes but was easier to carry and served as finger food for children. The potatoes provided energy while the bread stretched the portion further. Sometimes onions were grated into the potatoes for extra flavor, but even without them, the hash brown sandwich was a reliable filler. It reflected the ingenuity of families who could take one cheap staple and turn it into something more than the sum of its parts. Though it may sound excessive today, in the 1950s this was simply practical cooking. Hash brown sandwiches were proof that even humble ingredients could create something hearty. Grape jelly and cream cheese sandwiches combined two pantry staples into something that felt like a treat even when money was short. Housewives would spread cream cheese on one slice of bread, grape jelly on the other, and press them together for a quick, sweet, and tangy sandwich. The cream cheese gave it richness while the jelly provided bright sweetness, making it more filling than just jelly alone. Children loved the colorful combination, and mothers appreciated how easy it was to prepare. It was cheap, cheerful, and adaptable, often using whatever flavor of jelly was available in the pantry. Some families even toasted the bread to add crunch, making it feel fancier than it really was. This sandwich reflected how homemakers of the 1950s found ways to stretch food into something special, even when it was born from necessity. Grape jelly and cream cheese sandwiches may not be common anymore, but they once carried the comfort of home and the satisfaction of making do with what was available. Bacon skin sandwiches were born from the insistence that no part of the animal should ever go to waste. The leftover rind, often trimmed from bacon before cooking, was fried until crisp and then layered between slices of bread. The result was salty, chewy, and deeply flavorful, providing a taste of bacon without the expense of full slices. Families who could not afford to throw anything away cherished these sandwiches as a way to stretch protein into more meals. Housewives valued them because they turned scraps into something practical and even desirable. Children often enjoyed the crunch, while adults appreciated the smoky richness that still lingered in the rind. Bacon skin sandwiches carried pride because they showed how far thrift could go in making sure nothing edible was discarded. In the 1950s, it was about survival as much as flavor, and even the smallest bits of meat were transformed into a meal. This sandwich is rarely remembered today, but for many families, it was a lifeline. Turnip slice sandwiches were a simple way to add crunch and freshness without paying for expensive fillings. Housewives would peel turnips, slice them thinly, sprinkle with salt, and press them between bread slices. The result was sharp, crisp, and refreshing, offering a flavor somewhere between radish and cabbage. It was inexpensive and used a vegetable that grew well in many backyards, making it accessible to rural families. These sandwiches were not luxurious, but they provided texture and bulk when little else was available. Some versions included a thin spread of butter to soften the sharpness, but often the turnip was eaten plain. For many families, this was a reminder that survival meant working with whatever was on hand, even if it seemed humble. Children might not have been thrilled, but adults valued the practicality. Turnip slice sandwiches may sound unusual today, yet in the 1950s they were just another example of stretching resources and ensuring nothing went to waste. They embodied thrift in its simplest form. Powdered milk spread sandwiches reflected the struggles of homes that relied on powdered milk as a staple during lean years. Housewives would reconstitute the powder with water, stir in sugar or syrup, and create a sweet paste that could be spread onto bread. It was not glamorous, but it was filling and provided children with energy when other options were scarce. Powdered milk was cheaper than fresh milk and lasted longer in the pantry, making it a dependable ingredient. The spread was creamy, lightly sweet, and easy to prepare, though it never replaced the taste of real butter or cheese. For families with little money, it was better than going without. Children often saw it as a treat because of the added sweetness, while mothers saw it as survival. This sandwich carried the memory of thrift and resilience, showing how much homemakers relied on creativity to keep everyone fed. Powdered milk spread sandwiches have been forgotten, but they remain a quiet testament to making do with very little. celery salt and butter sandwiches were among the simplest yet most practical of the poor man's sandwiches. Soft bread was buttered generously, then dusted with celery salt to add a punch of flavor. It was inexpensive, fast to prepare, and required only 2 ingredients that many households already had on hand. The taste was salty, savory, and comforting, making it a reliable filler for children's snacks or quick lunches. Rural homes in particular embraced it because celery salt was cheap and long-lasting, and butter could be stretched thinly. It may not have looked impressive, but it satisfied hunger and kept families going when options were limited. Housewives valued the straightforward nature of the recipe, which was as quick as it was thrifty. For many families, it carried the taste of both comfort and necessity, proving that even the humblest foods could make a difference. Celery salt and butter sandwiches may sound outdated now, but in the 1950s they stood proudly as proof of survival on a shoestring budget. Pickled beet sandwiches brought both color and tang to the plain bread that housewives had to stretch as far as possible. Beets were cheap, easy to preserve, and often pickled in jars to last through long months when fresh produce was not available. Thin slices of pickled beets layered between bread gave a bright vinegary bite that stood out among otherwise plain meals. They bled their purple-red color into the bread, making the sandwich as striking as it was thrifty. Many families enjoyed this because it provided vegetables in a form that could last, while also adding acidity that made the meal taste fresher. Sometimes a thin spread of butter was added to soften the sharpness, but often the beets stood alone. Children were not always fond of the sour flavor, but adults appreciated the practicality. It was simple, filling, and dependable, which were the key qualities of a working family's lunch. Pickled beet sandwiches may not appear today at lunch tables, yet in the 1950s they were a proud example of turning preserved vegetables into survival food. Graham cracker peanut butter sandwiches were a creative way to turn a dessert cracker into a dependable meal. Housewives would crumble or crush graham crackers into peanut butter, creating a thick, sticky paste that stretched further than peanut butter alone. Spread on bread, this filling provided both sweetness and protein, making it practical and satisfying. Children loved the sweet crunch, while parents valued how far 1 jar of peanut butter could go when mixed with the crackers. It was especially useful when peanut butter supplies were limited, since the crackers bulked out the mixture without losing flavor. The sandwich was heavy, chewy, and packed with energy, perfect for keeping kids going through the school day or fathers through long hours of work. It did not look fancy, but it filled stomachs and kept families fed when choices were limited. Graham cracker peanut butter sandwiches are rarely remembered today, yet in the 1950s they showed how even snack foods could be adapted into survival meals. Canned peach and whipped oleo sandwiches reflected the blend of convenience and necessity that defined many 1950s kitchens. Margarine, often called oleo, was cheaper than butter and spread easily, while canned peaches provided sweetness and a taste of fruit when fresh options were unavailable. Housewives mashed peaches into the margarine, whipping the mixture into a spreadable paste that was both bright and filling. Pressed between slices of white bread, it became a sandwich that looked cheerful and tasted indulgent, even though it was entirely practical. The syrup from the peaches seeped into the bread, making it soft and sweet, while the oleo gave it richness. This sandwich carried the feeling of a treat, even though it was born from rationing and limited budgets. Families appreciated how far 1 can of peaches could stretch when turned into spread, especially when children craved something sweet. Canned peach and whipped oleo sandwiches may sound strange today, but they once represented both thrift and comfort in equal measure. Green pepper and egg sandwiches were the kind of filler meals that kept households going during lean stretches. Eggs were one of the most reliable protein sources, but even they had to be stretched when rationing or shortages hit. Housewives scrambled eggs with diced green peppers, bulking them up to serve more mouths without using as many eggs. The peppers added crunch, freshness, and a hint of bitterness, which balanced the creamy eggs. Spread onto bread, this combination became a hearty sandwich that worked for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. It was simple enough for children to enjoy, but hearty enough for working men needing energy for long shifts. Green peppers were affordable, especially in summer gardens, and pairing them with eggs created a balance of thrift and flavor. This sandwich showed how resourcefulness could turn two basic ingredients into a satisfying meal. Today, it might feel old-fashioned, but in the 1950s it was a staple for families stretching every bite. Vinegar sugar sandwiches were one of the more unusual yet memorable examples of thrift cooking. Bread was brushed with vinegar to give it sharpness, then sprinkled with sugar to balance it out, creating a sweet-sour bite that was unlike anything else. It was cheap, quick, and used ingredients that nearly every kitchen already had on hand. Children often enjoyed the sweetness, though the vinegar's tang sometimes divided opinions. Housewives turned to this when there was nothing else to put between slices of bread, proving how creativity and necessity shaped everyday meals. The vinegar soaked into the bread, softening it while the sugar added a crunchy texture on top. It may not have been filling compared to meat or vegetables, but it gave families a sense of variety when choices were limited. Vinegar sugar sandwiches are rarely remembered today, but they once carried the taste of both struggle and survival in kitchens across the country. Apple jelly and mustard sandwiches came from the strange yet practical combinations that often happened when kitchens were running low. Housewives would spread apple jelly on one slice of bread and mustard on the other, pressing them together to create a sandwich that was both sweet and sharp. It sounds unusual, but the balance of sugary fruit and spicy tang made it surprisingly edible. The flavors worked together in a way that kept the sandwich from being bland, and it made use of common pantry staples. Families that could not afford meat often leaned on sandwiches like this to give a sense of flavor and variety. It was quick, affordable, and easy to prepare, making it perfect for busy mothers feeding children on tight schedules. The sandwich carried no glamour, yet it reflected how the 1950s housewife kept her family nourished with whatever was available. Apple jelly and mustard sandwiches may not have survived into modern times, but they are a reminder of thrift turned into ingenuity. Lentil mash sandwiches were filling, hearty, and born from the need to stretch protein at the lowest cost. Lentils were cheap, easy to cook in large batches, and lasted well in storage. Housewives boiled them until soft, mashed them with onion or seasoning, and spread the mixture onto bread. The texture was thick and earthy, making the sandwich heavy and satisfying. It resembled a vegetarian pâté, though no one at the time would have called it that. For families unable to afford meat, this was a practical way to provide sustenance that kept stomachs full through the day. Lentil mash sandwiches reflected both the frugality of the era and the global influence of simple foods making their way into American homes. They carried protein, fiber, and substance, which made them a reliable staple in lean times. Lentil mash sandwiches may sound humble, but they reveal just how inventive 1950s housewives could be when feeding families. Parsnip and butter sandwiches were another example of stretching vegetables into simple yet dependable meals. Parsnips were inexpensive, stored well, and could be sliced thinly to serve as a filler in place of meat. Housewives would layer the slices on buttered bread, sometimes sprinkling with salt to bring out their sweetness. The result was crisp, earthy, and surprisingly refreshing for such a basic sandwich. It gave families variety when potatoes and carrots had already been served in countless forms. The butter added richness, while the parsnip kept it from being too heavy. These sandwiches were not glamorous, but they represented resilience and the practical use of every crop. They also reflected the gardening habits of many families, since parsnips were common in backyard plots. Parsnip and butter sandwiches have almost disappeared today, but they once carried the taste of thrift and practicality that defined the kitchens of 1950s America. Cold spaghetti sandwiches turned last night's dinner into tomorrow's lunch in the most practical way. Leftover pasta, often with a bit of tomato sauce still clinging to it, was stuffed into slices of bread to create a filling sandwich. It was messy, heavy, and surprisingly comforting, giving families a way to reuse food instead of wasting it. Children often ate these for lunch, with housewives grateful for how easy they were to prepare. Spaghetti was cheap, and stretching leftovers across sandwiches gave it even more value. Sometimes grated cheese was sprinkled in for added flavor, but more often it was plain and practical. These sandwiches were not about elegance, but about survival and thrift. They carried the taste of both yesterday's supper and today's ingenuity, proving that nothing in the kitchen went to waste. Cold spaghetti sandwiches are rarely spoken of today, but they once served as a reminder that in the 1950s, everything was stretched as far as it could go. Pimento loaf sandwiches were an affordable way to enjoy something that resembled deli meat without paying full price. Pimento loaf was a budget luncheon meat made by blending scraps of meat with pimentos and pressing it into a loaf. Sliced thinly and placed between white bread, it became a staple of frugal lunches. Housewives relied on it because it was cheaper than ham or turkey, but still gave the appearance of a proper sandwich. The bright red pimentos added both color and flavor, making the loaf feel more special than it really was. Families packed these sandwiches for school lunches, picnics, and quick meals at home. They were salty, soft, and filling, though no one mistook them for high-quality cuts of meat. Pimento loaf sandwiches were practical and dependable, reflecting the 1950s reliance on processed meats to stretch limited budgets. They may have faded from memory, but at one time they symbolized both frugality and the desire for something resembling a deli treat. Cabbage slaw sandwiches were one of the most resourceful ways housewives stretched their vegetables into filling meals. A simple vinegar-based slaw made from shredded cabbage, onions, and sometimes carrots was piled high between slices of bread, turning an inexpensive side into a full sandwich. The vinegar dressing kept the slaw fresh, making it a practical choice during hot months when spoilage was a concern. Housewives often made big batches of slaw from garden cabbages, so turning it into sandwiches ensured nothing went to waste. The crunch of the cabbage and the sharpness of vinegar made the sandwich feel lively even without meat or cheese. It was refreshing, easy to prepare, and gave families a dependable option for lunch boxes or quick suppers. Children were not always eager for so much cabbage, but it filled stomachs and kept costs low, which mattered most. Cabbage slaw sandwiches may not be common anymore, but they are a perfect example of how creativity turned humble vegetables into survival food during the 1950s. Maple syrup sandwiches were a sweet fix that gave children something to smile about during tough times. Housewives would soak slices of bread with syrup, creating a sticky, sugary filling that doubled as both a snack and a dessert. Maple syrup was not always real, often replaced with cheap corn syrup flavored to mimic it, but it worked just the same. Spread onto white bread or leftover rolls, it was quick to prepare and guaranteed to keep little ones happy. Parents saw it as a way to give energy and treat children without needing expensive ingredients like butter or meat. Sometimes margarine was spread on first, adding richness to balance the syrup's sweetness. It dripped, it stained fingers, and it was messy, but it was beloved because it was affordable joy in a time when treats were rare. Maple syrup sandwiches may not appear on modern tables, but in the 1950s they carried both thrift and sweetness, filling stomachs while lifting spirits. Homemade relish sandwiches were born from the end-of-garden harvests that left pantries overflowing with pickled jars. Housewives made relish from cucumbers, onions, peppers, or whatever vegetables were still hanging on in the garden, chopping and preserving them in vinegar brine. Spread onto bread, this tangy, crunchy filling became a thrifty sandwich option that tasted brighter than its humble parts. It worked well because the vinegar added sharpness, while the vegetables gave texture, creating something more substantial than plain bread and butter. Families enjoyed them in school lunches or as quick suppers when meat was scarce, appreciating the burst of flavor that cut through otherwise plain meals. Relish was also easy to make in large quantities, so jars often lined pantry shelves, waiting to be turned into sandwiches. These sandwiches were proof that thrift did not always have to be boring, since they gave variety at almost no cost. Homemade relish sandwiches may be forgotten today, but they were once everyday staples in frugal kitchens. Mashed turnip sandwiches were one of the many ways root vegetables filled in for missing ingredients. Turnips were cheap, hardy, and easy to grow, which made them perfect for families looking to stretch meals. Housewives boiled and mashed the turnips until smooth, mixing in margarine or drippings to add richness. Spread between slices of bread, the mash resembled potatoes, providing bulk without the higher cost. Turnips were not always popular for their flavor, but in sandwiches they became a practical solution when meat or cheese was not available. They filled stomachs, stretched pantry supplies, and gave families something warm and dependable to eat. This sandwich may not have been glamorous, but it carried the taste of resilience and thrift. Children may not have loved the earthy flavor, but adults knew the value of turning every crop into sustenance. Mashed turnip sandwiches show how 1950s housewives found clever ways to feed families with whatever they had at hand. Prune spread sandwiches turned a humble dried fruit into a sweet, filling treat. Prunes were boiled until soft, then mashed into a smooth paste, often sweetened with a little sugar if available. Spread onto buttered bread, this mixture became a thick, jam-like filling that was far cheaper than store-bought preserves. Housewives liked this because prunes were inexpensive and stored well, meaning they were always ready when other fruits were out of season. The sandwich had a rich, earthy sweetness that was surprisingly satisfying, making it popular for both children and adults. It was also seen as wholesome since prunes were known for being nutritious and keeping families full. A loaf of bread and a handful of prunes could stretch into several sandwiches, which made them an economical choice for large households. Today, prune spread might sound old-fashioned, but in the 1950s it was a clever way to turn simple ingredients into a sweet sandwich worth remembering. Scrapple sandwiches were a filling option that made use of every last scrap of meat. Scrapple itself was a mixture of pork trimmings and cornmeal cooked into a loaf that could be sliced and fried. Housewives would fry the slices until crisp on the outside, soft on the inside, then tuck them into bread for a hearty meal. It was salty, heavy, and rich, making it ideal for laborers who needed fuel for long days. Scrapple was popular in rural areas where nothing from the hog went to waste, and the sandwich version gave families a way to stretch it further. Sometimes mustard or onions were added for extra flavor, but often it was just bread and scrapple, simple and filling. The sandwich reflected both thrift and resourcefulness, proving that even the least glamorous cuts of meat could become something satisfying. Scrapple sandwiches may not be common today, but in the 1950s they symbolized survival and making the most of every hog. Onion jam sandwiches gave surprising depth of flavor without requiring expensive ingredients. Housewives slowly cooked onions until they caramelized into a sweet, jam-like spread, often with a little sugar or vinegar to enhance the taste. Spread thinly on bread, this created a savory sweet sandwich that felt more indulgent than it really was. It was practical because onions were cheap, stored well, and could be grown in most gardens. The caramelization process brought out flavors that made the onions seem like a luxury item, even when they were nothing more than basics. Families appreciated the way this sandwich felt special, without costing more than a few pennies worth of onions. Sometimes butter or margarine was added, but often the jam was enough to carry the sandwich. Onion jam sandwiches may not be widely remembered today, but they were an example of how 1950s kitchens transformed everyday vegetables into meals with surprising depth and comfort. Cold cornbread sandwiches were a thrifty way of using leftovers in households where nothing could be wasted. Leftover cornbread, often baked in large pans, was sliced and used like regular bread. Housewives would split pieces in half and smear them with lard, drippings, or even just a little salt to make a quick sandwich. It was dense and hearty, making it filling enough to carry laborers through long workdays. Families often relied on this when wheat bread ran out, since cornbread was cheaper to make and more widely available in rural areas. The texture was heavier than regular bread, but it was satisfying in its own right. These sandwiches reflected both resourcefulness and the Southern traditions of making cornbread central to daily meals. Cold cornbread sandwiches may not be common now, but they once served as a dependable option that kept households full when money and ingredients were scarce. Sweetened condensed milk sandwiches were one of the quickest and most satisfying fixes for children craving sweets. Housewives would spoon the thick, sticky milk straight from the can onto slices of bread, creating a sugary, creamy filling. It was messy but beloved, since the milk had both richness and sweetness that felt indulgent. Families relied on this because canned milk was cheap, shelf-stable, and stretched much further than butter or jam. Children loved it as a lunchbox treat or after-school snack, while parents appreciated its practicality. It provided quick energy and made use of pantry staples that were always on hand. Though it might sound unusual today, it was once one of the simplest joys a household could manage during lean years. Sweetened condensed milk sandwiches show how 1950s kitchens turned even basic canned goods into comfort food that carried both nostalgia and practicality. Pickle relish and egg sandwiches were a clever way to make a single egg serve 2 or more people. Hard-boiled eggs were chopped finely and mixed with pickle relish, creating a spread that added bulk, texture, and sharpness. Spread onto bread, it resembled egg salad, but with more bite, thanks to the vinegar from the relish. Housewives liked this because it stretched eggs further, making them last longer during shortages or tight budgets. Children appreciated the flavor, while adults valued the practicality of turning one egg into multiple servings. Sometimes mayonnaise was added for creaminess, but often it was just eggs and relish, simple and affordable. These sandwiches were packed into lunches or served as light suppers, representing thrift and ingenuity at the same time. Pickle relish and egg sandwiches may have faded from popularity, but they remain a perfect example of how housewives stretched every ingredient to its fullest. Turkey and cranberry pemmican sandwiches were the original trail mix meets Thanksgiving dinner. Dried shreds of wild turkey were pounded with rendered fat and tart cranberries, then pressed into dense cakes or layered inside split cornbread pouches. This was not a meal made for pleasure, it was made for endurance. But somehow, the sweet-savory combination felt familiar, even warm. Carried during northeastern winters, this portable power food was eaten during hunts, travels, or times when game was scarce and the snow ran deep. Sometimes additional nuts or seeds were mixed in, and when cornbread was on hand, it became a sandwich, dense, chewy, and surprisingly rich. It didn't need refrigeration, it didn't spoil quickly, and it held the memory of autumn feasts long after the season had passed. Today, pemmican is known mostly among survivalists and historians, but this specific turkey and cranberry version was once common in the colder woodland regions. It's strange to think a meal this ancient tastes so much like the holidays, but maybe that's the point. It held on to warmth when everything else had frozen. The chow mein sandwich was chaos held together by 2 buns, and somehow it worked. Born in southeastern Massachusetts, this Frankenstein creation placed a mound of crispy chow mein noodles smothered in thick brown gravy between 2 hamburger buns. The result was a crunchy, savory, totally illogical meal that became a school lunch staple in some corners of the country. Kids would unwrap their foil-wrapped mystery and find a puddle of sauce and starch that somehow filled every craving and left fingers coated in grease. This was the kind of sandwich you could not eat neatly, and that was half the fun. The noodles poked out the sides, the sauce soaked into the bread, and no 2 bites were ever the same. The chow mein sandwich was a lunchtime dare wrapped in cultural mashup, a reminder that not all great foods make perfect sense on paper. Over time, regional oddities like this one gave way to standardization. 1 bite, and you were somewhere between comfort food and total confusion, and somehow that felt exactly right. The egg salad sandwich is creamy, comforting, and unmistakably retro. Made from chopped hard-boiled eggs mixed with mayonnaise, mustard, maybe a dash of paprika or chopped celery, it's been a lunchtime standby for decades. Spread thickly onto white or wheat bread, it's soft enough to squish between your fingers but rich enough to feel like a meal. Grandmas packed them for road trips, office workers brought them in wax paper, and diners offered them as a cooling option on hot days. It wasn't fancy, but it was familiar, a quiet kind of indulgence. Every family had their own version, some chunkier, some smoother, some with green olives or scallions, others strictly plain. There's something nostalgic about the way it smells when you unwrap it, and the way the bread sticks just a little to the roof of your mouth. The egg salad sandwich never tried to compete with cold cuts. It just showed up, creamy and loyal, ready to carry you through till dinner. Buffalo heart sandwiches on stone bread were once reserved for warriors and hunters. thin slices of buffalo heart grilled directly over open flame, then served on thick, chewy rounds of unleavened bread cooked on hot stones. This wasn't just food, it was fuel. Dense with iron and flavor, the heart meat had a gamey bite softened only slightly by the bread's smoky crust. It was eaten with bare hands, no utensils, no ceremony, just fire and hunger. Some added wild herbs, others nothing at all. It was a meal designed to travel, to sustain through hard rides or long scouts across open plains. The bread, dense and flat, could last for days. The heart, once cooked, was chewy but nourishing. In colder months, the sandwich would be wrapped in hide and tucked into a satchel, staying warm for hours against the body. Today, buffalo heart is more likely to be seen as an oddity at a specialty butcher, the tradition forgotten or sanitized into restaurant novelty. But once, this sandwich told a story of strength, sacrifice, and survival, etched into every bite by hands hardened from the land. Egg salad sandwiches were messy, mushy, and magical in the way only school lunch legends can be. Made from chopped hard-boiled eggs, mayonnaise, and a touch of mustard or seasoning, egg salad was the sandwich that smelled strong and stuck with you, literally and figuratively. It was packed between slices of soft bread and often left a faint imprint on the bag it came in. And yet, it was beloved. There was something comforting about it, something that felt homemade and humble. It was a meal you could trust. Some versions had bits of celery or onion, others kept it basic. But every egg salad sandwich came with a promise. You were going to be full, and you were going to remember it. Kids either cherished it or turned up their noses. There was no in-between. But for those who loved it, egg salad was the crown jewel of the lunchbox. Today, it is often replaced by cleaner, quieter options, tucked away in prepackaged containers at the back of the deli case. The MCDLT was a burger with a gimmick that actually worked. McDonald's served it in a special two-sided foam container. One half had the hot patty and bottom bun. The other half had lettuce, tomato, cheese, pickles, and the top bun. The point was to keep the hot side hot and the cool side cool. You had to assemble it yourself. It felt fancy. It felt fun. You would peel back that lid like you were opening something futuristic. A burger with a strategy. The lettuce was still crisp. The tomato was not wilted. The burger was steaming. Then you folded it together and took a bite. It was fast food pretending to be thoughtful. It only lasted a few years in the 1980s before disappearing, partly because the packaging was not great for the environment. But for a while, dads on their lunch breaks or families in the station wagon would crack open that container and feel like they were part of the future, not just a burger, an experience in two halves coming together in one bite. Cucumber sandwiches were delicate little reminders that even the school lunch table had room for refinement. Slices of cucumber, thin, chilled, often peeled, rested on buttered bread, sometimes layered with cream cheese or a dash of dill. The bread was soft, sometimes crustless, sometimes rye. It was like a tea party had wandered into the cafeteria. Cucumber sandwiches were quiet, crisp and cooling, refreshing in a world of meat and mustard. They did not make a mess. They did not leave a smell. But they stood out, precisely because they did not try to. These sandwiches were usually packed by someone who believed in manners, napkins, and balance. They were for the kid with the neat lunchbox, the thermos that never leaked, and the sandwiches that never squished. But they were not boring. Today, they are mostly seen at brunches or fancy luncheons. But back then, they were a gentle rebellion against the chaos of the cafeteria tray. Tomato sandwiches were summer captured between slices of white bread, simple and sublime. Nothing more than fresh, juicy tomato slices, a generous smear of mayonnaise, and a sprinkle of salt and pepper. That was it. But somehow, it was everything. The bread soaked up the juice until it was just on the edge of falling apart. The mayo added richness. The salt made the tomato sing. And when you bit into it, it felt like sunshine. These sandwiches were often packed right after a backyard harvest or a trip to the local farmer's stand. They were the definition of seasonal eating. No heating, no meat, just freshness layered onto something soft and humble. Kids either loved the tomato sandwich or hated it. There was no in-between. But for those who did love it, nothing else would do. The sandwich tasted like summer break, like porch swings and cicadas, like sitting in class and counting down the days until school let out. Tomato sandwiches came and went with the season, and when they left, you missed them. You remembered how something so simple could somehow be so full. Prairie chicken was once so common on the plains that people barely looked twice when it landed on their plate. These days, you'd be lucky to spot one outside a conservation area. But back then, its lean, almost pheasant-like meat was a staple for hunters and homesteaders. Sandwiches were built around it, typically layered inside a dense cornbread pocket with spicy mustard leaves gathered from nearby fields. The cornbread wasn't the sweet version we know today either. It was rough, baked in cast iron or even directly over coals. The mustard leaves added bite and helped cut through the meat's earthiness. Sometimes wild onions or a dab of rendered fat made their way into the mix. It was a sandwich built from necessity but remembered with pride. A true frontier meal that's all but vanished in modern kitchens. Except maybe in memory. Wild rice cake sandwiches with duck were sticky, rich, and deeply satisfying. Meals built near lakes, cooked over fire, and eaten with reverence. The rice was hand-harvested by canoe, soaked and shaped into firm patties, then griddled until crisp on the outside and chewy inside. Duck meat, usually smoked or slow-roasted, went between them. No sauce needed. The fat from the duck seeped into the rice, making each bite earthy, oily, and full of depth. These were celebration foods and everyday lunches rolled into one. The sandwich was portable, delicious, and deeply tied to the rhythms of water and migration. Wild rice still exists, but much of it is cultivated and stripped of its ritual. Duck is a delicacy now, not a staple. Together, they were once food and identity. We have kept the ingredients, but not the reason. Can you taste the difference when you do not know why it mattered? The cheese and pickle sandwich is one of those odd combinations that divides people at the very first bite. On one side of the bread, you've got sharp cheddar or American cheese. On the other, sliced dill pickles or even sweet bread and butter chips. It's a collision of creamy and tangy, savory and sour. Some folks butter the bread, some toast it, others eat it plain and cold. But the core idea remains the same. It's a sandwich that feels retro in the best way. Like something you'd find packed in wax paper alongside a thermos of milk. It's humble but bold, weird but strangely addictive. Born from the era of rationing and refrigerator scrounging, it was perfect for meatless lunches or quick snacks when the deli drawer was bare, and somehow it always worked, especially if the cheese was sharp enough to bite back. Today, it lives on in lunchboxes, late-night cravings, and memories of brown bag field trips. It might not be everyone's favorite, but for those who get it, there's nothing else quite like it. Peanut butter and marshmallow sandwiches were sticky, chewy, and completely chaotic in the best way. Unlike the Fluffernutter, which used smooth marshmallow creme, this version went old school, layering whole marshmallows right onto the peanut butter. The result was messier, thicker, and somehow more exciting. As you bit down, the marshmallows gave a stretch and the peanut butter clung to everything. Your teeth, the roof of your mouth, your fingers. It was the kind of sandwich that slowed you down, made you chew carefully, and left sweet residue in the corners of your smile. Some kids toasted it, watching the marshmallows melt into gooey bliss. Others just packed it cold and let the sandwich warm up on its own in their backpack by noon. Either way, it was dessert disguised as lunch, and it was glorious. You rarely saw it outside of grade school, but back then, it was a lunchbox secret weapon. No meat, no greens, no apologies, just joy between two slices of bread. Hazelnut and wild onion spread sandwiches were the definition of less is more. Made by grinding roasted hazelnuts into a creamy paste and folding in finely chopped wild onions, the mixture was then spread onto thin, grainy flatbreads. Sometimes the flatbread was made from acorn or chestnut flour. Other times it was just coarse ground maize. The result was earthy, pungent, and filling. This was a forager's lunch, light to carry, dense with nutrients, and quick to prepare. You could eat it cold or warm it slightly over stones. Some versions were spiced with foraged herbs or ramp bulbs. Today, hazelnut paste is something you find in chocolates and spreads, but in the old days, it was protein fuel from the forest floor. The onions? Pulled straight from the soil, not shipped in from a warehouse. The hot brown was what you made when you had leftovers and a little bit of pride. Open-faced, built on a thick slice of toast, then loaded with turkey and bacon. But what made it special was the Mornay sauce, a rich, cheesy bechamel poured over the top and broiled until it bubbled and browned. It came out of Louisville, Kentucky from the Brown Hotel, but it made its way to family tables when there was turkey to use up and dads wanted something more than a cold sandwich. It was warm. It was indulgent. And it felt like dinner, even if it was built from scraps. Some versions added tomato slices, some skipped the broiler. But the essence stayed. Meat, cheese, bread, and heat. Working men who came home hungry could make one in 10 minutes. It was not pretty. It did not stack well. But it hit the spot and filled the plate. Sometimes that was all you asked of a meal. Liverwurst sandwiches were bold. You knew it the moment someone unwrapped one across the table. That unmistakable scent, rich and meaty, mixed with sharp mustard or sliced onions, hit like a wave. The sandwich itself was unapologetically old school, usually served on rye or pumpernickel bread, often from a family who still shopped at the neighborhood butcher. Liverwurst was spreadable sausage, soft but full of iron and flavor, and it had no intention of going unnoticed. It was the sandwich your grandpa swore by, the one your parents either embraced or exiled. And for kids, it was a gamble, either a lunchroom legend or a quick trade for something with peanut butter. But for those who loved it, liverwurst was gold. It was hearty. It was grown up. It was tradition sliced thick and pressed between slices of something dark and sturdy. Liverwurst never begged for your approval. It knew it was not for everyone. Today, you hardly see it outside specialty stores and deli counters. But for a time, it was part of the rotation. Loved by few, remembered by all. Juniper berry roasted squirrel isn't a punchline. It was survival food that somehow managed to taste like it belonged at a campfire banquet. When meat was scarce, squirrels were plentiful, especially in wooded regions where they practically fell into the stew pot. Roasting them with crushed juniper berries gave the gamey meat a bright, piney lift. Once tender, the meat was shredded and packed into flatbread, usually made from whatever grain or seed flour was on hand, acorn, corn, or even cattail. The sandwich was small but rich, chewy but satisfying. Hunters ate it on the trail, families shared them during autumn gatherings, and kids likely learned early not to waste even the tail. Juniper helped with digestion too, making it medicinal as much as flavorful. Today, most folks would turn up their noses at squirrel meat, but back then, it was simply another part of the land's offering. One bite of that peppery, slightly wild sandwich, and you'd understand. It was rough country cuisine with a surprising touch of finesse. Peanut butter and pickle sandwiches were the lunchbox legends nobody admits to loving, but many still secretly miss. Born out of the Great Depression, this odd pairing was less about culinary boldness and more about making do with what was left in the pantry. Peanut butter was cheap, packed with protein and shelf-stable. Pickles added crunch, tang, and just enough bite to wake up plain white bread. Somehow, the combination worked. The sweet creaminess of the peanut butter and the sharp, vinegary snap of a dill or bread and butter pickle created a balance that stayed with you, whether you liked it or not. These sandwiches were slipped into wax paper and handed off like rationed gold. Some kids traded them. Others guarded them with their lives. They were cheap. They were weird. And they were unforgettable. As the decades rolled on and lunch menus got glossier, peanut butter and pickle sandwiches faded from view. It might not win a gourmet prize today, but back then, it was a masterpiece made from struggle and stubbornness. The manwich sandwich is what happens when you need dinner in 10 minutes and your pantry has exactly 2 ingredients, a can of manwich sauce and a pound of ground beef. It's the store-bought shortcut to a sloppy Joe, soaked in sweet, tangy tomato sauce and ready to heap on a hamburger bun. No chopping, no spice rack, no slow simmer, just brown the beef, pour the can, and you're done. In the 70s and 80s, it became a weeknight hero, advertised as, "A sandwich is a sandwich, but a manwich is a meal." It was a dinner-time fix for busy parents, latchkey kids, and anyone with a microwave and a spoon. The smell alone could draw kids out of their bedrooms like moths to a flame. Some added cheese, others pickles or onions, but most just kept it simple. It wasn't glamorous, but it got the job done. Today it still holds a place in the hearts of those who remember TV trays, linoleum kitchens, and the clink of a can opener on a Tuesday night. Wild plum and smoked turkey and early native pitas. It sounds like something out of a high-end cookbook, but it was a winter staple for many northeastern tribes. The turkey, smoked over slow embers with bark and pine, kept for weeks. The wild plums, boiled down into a thick, tart chutney, added both preservation and punch. The pita wasn't quite what we imagine today. It was a thin cornbread round, flexible enough to fold but sturdy enough to hold meat and fruit. Each bite was smoky, tangy, and just sweet enough to feel nourishing. In the lean winter months, this sandwich wasn't just practical, it was brilliant. High in protein, balanced in flavor, and compact for travel. Hunters carried them, mothers packed them, and elders handed down the recipe orally. Now it's barely remembered outside food anthropology circles, but it deserves a place among history's great handheld meals. Somehow, ancient practicality always had a way of tasting good. Fried bologna sandwiches were the working-class answer to gourmet, cheap, greasy, and absolutely perfect. A slice of bologna slapped into a hot skillet until it curled at the edges, sometimes scored in the center to keep it flat, then dropped onto bread and finished with mustard, cheese, or whatever was around. It sizzled, it popped, it smelled like something you were not supposed to enjoy this much, and kids loved it. The edges got crisp, the center stayed soft. It was the kind of sandwich that left a grease spot on the bag and a smile on your face. Fried bologna was not subtle, but it was reliable. It was warm and familiar. It made lunch feel like breakfast and dinner all at once. Parents made them quickly, often with one hand on the stove and the other helping with homework. It was the sandwich of multitaskers, of big families and thin budgets. And yet it tasted rich. It felt like a treat. Today you barely see them unless you go looking. But for those who grew up on it, fried bologna was not just food. It was a full sensory memory wrapped in white bread. The fish stick sandwich was a miracle of convenience. Frozen breaded rectangles of fish, crisped in the oven and stacked onto sandwich bread with a squeeze of tartar sauce or even ketchup. It was a staple of elementary school lunches and tired weeknights, usually accompanied by applesauce or peas that rolled around the plate. Kids loved it because it was mild and crunchy, and parents loved it because it was quick. Most fish stick sandwiches weren't trying to win awards. They were trying to make everyone stop complaining. Some households elevated them with cheese, lettuce, or soft hoagie rolls, but others stayed true to the basics: white bread, fish sticks, and whatever sauce was nearby. This sandwich was often the first introduction to seafood for picky eaters, cloaked in crunch and comfort. There was something weirdly satisfying about lining up the fish sticks like puzzle pieces, making sure every bite had one. It wasn't gourmet, but it got us through. Smoked trout cornbread sandwiches were the northern traveler's treasure. Smoked flaked fish folded into thick slices of cornmeal bread packed tight for the road. It was not fancy, but it was powerful. Tribes along cold lakes and mountain rivers smoked their fish until it could last for weeks, then sandwiched it between pan-fried or stone-baked cornbread slabs. The result was portable, rich in protein, and layered with smoke and earth. A bite of this and you got the forest, the stream, and the campfire in one go. The sandwich was eaten on horseback, in canoes, or tucked in bark pouches during hunting treks. The trout, pink and oily, often mixed with herbs or wild onions, The cornbread was dense and hearty, able to hold its shape for days without crumbling. Today, these sandwiches are nearly extinct, replaced by crackers and canned spreads that barely hint at what used to be. The trout is still there, and so is the cornmeal, but the memory of pressing them together in survival and ceremony has faded. What was once instinctual is now sold separately at specialty food stores. Do we even know what we lost when the smoke stopped rising from those riverside camps? Chicken salad sandwiches were the quiet heroes of the lunchroom, the kind of sandwich that looked unassuming but delivered comfort in every bite. They started with leftover chicken, chopped fine or shredded, then folded into mayonnaise with bits of celery, sometimes a hint of onion, maybe a touch of mustard or dill. It all depended on who made it. Every family had their version. Some were creamy, some were chunky, some were elegant enough for tea parties and school lunch alike. Slapped between slices of white wheat or a buttered roll, chicken salad was never flashy, but it never disappointed. It felt like home, like Sundays turned into Mondays. It was cold, clean, and quietly satisfying. Kids who got a chicken salad sandwich in their lunchbox were either praised or pitied, depending on who you asked, but they always remembered it. Today, chicken salad has migrated to cafe menus and plastic deli containers, far from its humble homemade origins. The pimento cheese sandwich is a Southern tradition that spread like wildfire through cafeterias, picnics, and family reunions. The filling, a creamy, tangy blend of shredded cheese, mayonnaise, and diced pimentos, was made by the bowlful and kept in the fridge for whenever company came over. On soft white bread, it was the perfect blend of smooth and savory, with a little kick if you added pepper or hot sauce. Some versions came grilled, others were left cold, served with chips or sweet tea on the side. At its heart, it was an inexpensive way to feel fancy. Somewhere between a spread and a dip, it clung to its bread like glue, and nobody minded. For many, it tastes like church potlucks, backyard folding tables, and long afternoons under the fan. In certain households, it wasn't just a sandwich, it was a rite of passage, handed down in recipes scribbled on index cards with mayonnaise stains. You don't just eat a pimento cheese sandwich, you remember it. Roasted grasshopper cakes with choke cherry glaze were the original protein bars. Grasshoppers were toasted until crisp and nutty, then folded into a simple grain batter and cooked like pancakes or cakes. Once cooled, they were glazed with boiled-down choke cherry syrup, dark, tart, and sticky. You could eat them hot off the griddle or carry them for days. They were light but filling, with a crunch that surprised anyone unfamiliar. Grasshoppers weren't seen as strange. They were a respected source of clean, abundant protein. The choke cherry, with its deep red hue and sharp bite, added color and complexity. This was not a joke food. It was real fuel, prepared with care. Today, we shy away from insects on the plate, calling them pests instead of provisions. But once, these little cakes were survival in a pocket, nourishment in a bite, and proof that the land always provided. You just had to listen. Cheese and apple sandwiches were the bite you never knew you needed. Sweet, sharp, and surprisingly grown up for something packed in a kid's lunchbox. Thin slices of crisp apple, usually red or golden, laid against salty cheddar cheese and pressed between soft bread, created a mix of flavor that hit every corner of the tongue. The crunch of the apple, the tang of the cheese, it all worked. There was something about that pairing, fruit and dairy, sweet and savory, that felt more like a farmer's market find than a cafeteria mainstay. But for many kids, especially those with creative parents or fond memories of fall, it was a staple. Sometimes it showed up on wheat bread, sometimes toasted. Occasionally even wrapped in foil with a note that said, "Eat me cold, it's better that way." It was not a flashy sandwich. No bright colors or sauces. Just good ingredients and smart contrast. Over time, it faded into the background as processed snacks took over, but that apple and cheese combo still feels like one of those rare lunchbox moments when everything just made sense. Bear-fat biscuit sandwiches with currants were not made for dainty appetites. The biscuits, dense and crumbly, were enriched with rendered bear fat instead of lard or butter. This gave them a rich, almost savory depth, And when split and filled with stewed wild currants or berry jam, they became something close to dessert, though they were always eaten as real sustenance. Bear fat was prized not just for its high energy but also for its medicinal and preservative properties. Currants provided vitamin C and a tart brightness that cut through the heavy fat. These sandwiches were eaten in colder climates, often during hunting expeditions or seasonal migrations. They traveled well and tasted even better after a day's work. Today, bear fat is nearly extinct from the pantry, seen more as a novelty than a necessity. But these sandwiches once carried people through winters and wilderness both. Tell us which poor man's sandwich you dare to bite into, then smash that like button and subscribe for more retro food fun.